For my research, I read Chapter 6 of Thomas Kidd's book, George Whitefield, America's Spiritual Founding Father, which details Whitefield's time in New England. This chapter details a lot of the tension during the Great Awakening surrounding the relationship between faith and works. Jerome Mahaffey at Baylor University talks about the style of Whitefield's preaching when he writes, "Fundamental beliefs of a culture are warranted and articulated by its predominant religious institution, compacted and symbolically coded into doctrines, rituals, liturgies, stories, and music to provide repetitive reminders of what people ought to believe and how they ought to behave." Whitefield's itinerant preaching was certainly filled with doctrine and ritual, but he, along with several of his contemporaries, argued that if through his preaching he could change what someone believed, the actions would follow suit. The actions were not a requirement for the belief to be validated. He had several people who agreed with him on this, but he also had several critics on this idea. This particular chapter highlighted several notable people, both friends of Whitefield and critics. Jonathan Edwards, one of the friends of Whitefield, invited Whitefield to his church in Northampton, Massachusetts, as they shared a vision for revivalism, for Calvinist teaching, and emotional responses in individual faith. Whitefield also worked with Ben Franklin to get some of his works published and widespread. This seemed to serve both him and Franklin, as his works became widespread, and Franklin was able to use his printing to gain notoriety in the colonies. John Wesley would have been seen as slight opposition, as they disagreed on the Calvinist Arminian argument, but both held tightly to salvation by faith alone. Several others were more cautious of this language for fear of dispelling the depth of works in one's religious relationship with Christ. Unfortunately, so much so to include it as a prerequisite to salvation. John Tittleston was a moderate Anglican who went back and forth with Whitefield on a number of different occasions, and would have been animate that works were required for salvation. This would have been a huge hang-up for Whitefield and something that he argued and used pretty strong language, as seen in the book, to pull people away from this idea that works were required for salvation. Another name mentioned in the chapter was Archibald Cummins, who actually worked closely with Whitefield before this debate between him and Tittleston. Originally partnered with Whitefield, Cummins took a step back to partner more with Tittleston after he saw the arguments that they were having. This tension between the role of works and faith did not seem to be the sole issue of Whitefield's critics, however. The style in which Whitefield preached and compelled people to individualize their faith was also a point of contention. The more outdoor revivals grew, the less the colonists were dependent on churches for their faith and spiritual growth. These values of individualism, growth, autonomy are clear values that put the American Revolution into stride, and the Great Awakening kind of set the foundation for that to take place. Where traditional Anglicanism, like Tittleston and Cummins, would have emphasized communal growth and submission to authority, those ideas were losing their grip on colonial culture. The more Whitefield preached, the less power any individual denomination had, including Anglicanism. The more Whitefield preached, the more this took place. This naturally led to the patriot cause growing, and even later developed into the separation of church and state. Whitefield believed that if everybody could interpret Scripture on their own, and they were all capable of this, there was less and less of a need for a state church, and really, when it came down to it, there was less and less need for any church at all. Roger Schultz from Liberty University categorized the Puritan faith by several different non-religious distinctives, including the value of individualism and responsibility. He says, Puritan theology emphasizes church autonomy and self-governance, not the rule of a church by a king or the rule of a church by a bishop, but rather the rule of a church by the people through their elected representatives. These ideas of individualism and democracy were ideas that were proponents of the church and Puritan theology that Whitefield was a part of, and really set the foundation for the American Revolution to take place.